welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Public Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessica, one of your hosts today. My co-host is
Jen. Hi.
And we're welcoming back one of our absolute favorite authors ever. Please tell everybody who you are. We know who you are, but
This is Grady Hendrix, back again for more.
You keep coming back.
I know. What's wrong with me?
No. Your book, How to Sell a Haunted House, is awesome. It is so good. It's amazing. Jen, do you have anything to say before we let Grady talk?
Oh my gosh. Just against all of my best efforts, I've read this book like in a day and a half. Like I really wanted to savor it, and like make it last, but like I just like blazed through it. It was like so propulsive and it like readable. Like it was like great. Like
No, thanks. I really appreciate that. It's always weird when someone says that because on the one hand, that's how I want you to read the book. But there's always a tiny part of my mind that's like, but it took me 18 months to write it.
Yeah.
Well, this one was really hard to land. I had 3 vastly different versions of this book before I kind of got to this 4th one, where it was different throughout, but the back third was wildly different. I mean, there were puppet cults in one of them. There was all kinds of weird stuff. And this is the right ending, but it really took me a long time to get there. I was actually getting really, really nervous because it's always tough to figure a book out, but like I'd never had this much trouble before.
So like at some point, I hope you put a pin in puppet cults and we'll come back to that because I would read that freaking book. But let's talk about this one. So tell us a little bit about How to Sell a Haunted House. Technically, this is the 3rd book, which is set in the same neighborhood. Am I correct?
Yeah, the 3rd and final one set in Charleston, where I'm from. I think I've said everything I have to say about Charleston. I don't think I can go too far afield because I've got to write about a place that I know pretty well. Otherwise, it just doesn't feel convincing to me. But, I'm writing a book now for 2024 that's set in St. Augustine. So another southern, very old, historic tourist town on the East Coast, within driving distance of Charleston.
Horror. I love Florida horror.
Yeah.
There is so much in Florida that lends itself to horror.
Yeah, and when I went down there to do research, I realized like the bugs are brutal, man. Like I walked into the woods at one point just to sort of like, be in the woods and get a feel for that. And within seconds, I was running for my car because I was just swarmed by these horrible black flies. Like going up your nose, everything. So yeah, that's Florida really treated me rough. But yeah, so How to Sell a Haunted House. It's about 2 adult siblings, a brother and a sister who hate each other. And they have to come back together, much against their will, to clean out and sell their childhood home after their parents die in an accident. And I feel like that's something we're all going to have to do at some point. I've had to do it for friends before. A friend of mine was just doing it for his parents while I was writing this book, his dad. And so it's just, one of those things. And as my parents get older, they're in their late 80s now. It's one of those things that really my sisters and I are becoming more and more aware of, not just we're going to have to deal with all the stuff our parents leave behind, but also, what's our family like? Our parents have been the common denominator and there's 5 of us. And so it's kind of like, how do we relate to each other once they're gone? And so that's been really weird to figure out. And I think that was really on my mind when I was writing this book. And the house is haunted. The brother and sister are cleaning out, obviously. It says that right there in the title. And unfortunately, it's haunted by puppets and dolls, which I really feel bad about doing that to readers.
Wait a second, why do you feel bad about doing that to readers?
Because every time I say that, you can see people cringe and sort of swallow their gorge a little. It's disgusting.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think one of the funny things with puppets and dolls, and a puppet's just a doll turned up to 11. But the funny thing with dolls is that we're all kind of like, ew, gross, haunted dolls. And we immediately start thinking of like, Victorian dolls and frilly dresses with porcelain faces. But, I grew up there's clown dolls on the sofa. There's a harlequin, sitting on the sideboard. And then you think about like, you walk into an office, well, I don't really know about an office these days, or an office in 2019, everyone's cubicles full of Funkos and baby Yodas, and dogs have toys that are shaped like dolls. And, we're surrounded. Yeah, like we're surrounded by them, action figure collectors and all this stuff. Like we love little miniature versions of ourselves.
That is so interesting to me too, about like how there is this image of like the haunted doll. Cause I'm even thinking of like, the Annabelle movies, like
Sure.
the way that they designed the doll for those films is she's like overtly horrifying. She has like the pale porcelain face and like a very hostile demeanor. But like if you see the actual Annabelle doll from like, footage from the Warrens' home, it's like a Raggedy Ann doll, it's a rag doll. It's
I
bright
had
red.
that doll. I had that Raggedy Ann doll.
Yeah.
Did you really?
Still in my parents. Yes. If you want it, I will mail it to you. Because
No,
it is
thanks.
in my parents' house that has to be cleaned out, and it has Andy with it. So you're welcome to it.
God, no. But it's funny, right? Because I think one of the things I was really conscious of was that image. And so, the brother and sister, Mark and Louise, in the book, their mom has a Christian puppet ministry. And so their house is full of puppets, but they're not scary, but they're like Muppety puppets. They're made of foam and felt and all that stuff, because that's more what people do. I find that just as scary as some creepy looking puppet with like, an old dirty face made of wood. But it's not where your mind first goes with haunted. But I don't know. I like the world around us a lot. I don't feel a need to alter it too much. I really love that sort of a liminal space you find in like the suburbs sometimes, where it's like, it's not quite a park. It's not quite an empty lot. It's, dead malls. A friend of mine they got their vaccination center was in a dead mall. And they were sending me pictures from it. I mean, all these weird kind of anonymous retail spaces and commercial spaces and houses. I mean, I stay in a lot of Airbnbs when I'm on the road doing book tour stuff. And there is a style of sort of anonymous Airbnb style that I find really disturbing. I don't know if you guys saw that movie Barbarian that came out last year.
Yes.
I found the stuff set in the Airbnb way more terrifying than the stuff set in the underground murder tunnels, because I've been in that Airbnb. They're all the same.
And you mentioned dead malls, which is a little bit of a niche obsession of mine.
Oh, okay. Are there any out there where you are?
I mean, all malls are dead malls if you think about it the right way. I mean, I think like,
True.
to be honest with you, I feel like, yes. However, I think the most dead of the dead malls was recently taken over and is kind of becoming something else. But man, there's something about that is super, super unsettling, especially if you grew up in the golden age of malls. So
it's funny. I don't know if y'all know the Righteous Gemstones, that Danny McBride show on HBO. But they use Citadel Mall, which was the big hip shopping mall when I was growing up and is now dead. They use that as their soundstage. So I'll watch the show and I'll be like, oh my God, they're like this church is Citadel Mall. Everything is set in Citadel Mall. So it's weird. I'm like seeing my childhood in that show. It's a weird experience.
In addition to that, the third season of Stranger Things has this big mall scene, which is set, I think, in the Gwinnett County Mall in Georgia, which is a dead mall, and there was a murder there. So.
Oh, no way.
100%. So anyway,
man.
But getting back to so Louise and Mark's mom, her parents died in a car crash. They're living completely different lives, Louise and Mark. Louise comes back to deal with the aftermath of the death and all of that not so fun stuff. But you mentioned that her mom was part of a Christian puppet ministry. Is there such a thing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. My cousin has a puppet ministry. A lot of, it's a really, it used to be, I think it used to be a little bigger than it is now in the 90s and early 2000s, but I don't know, man. But yeah, there's a Christian puppetry conference and all this stuff. It's really, it's aimed at kids. And I also think, a lot of people, if they're super involved in their church, are looking for artistic expression, right? They belong to the choir, the handbell choir. My mom was in the handbell choir. They teach art at the Sunday school. So, to me, it's a small leap.
I just find like the relationship between like puppeteer and puppet to be like outside of a horror context is already kind of creepy,
Yeah.
Within a horror context is even creepier. Because I remember like in college, I was putting together like a Dante show. I was doing like a divine comedy type thing. And this puppeteer woman auditioned and she did a bit, and she kept like, while she was talking to me, like sliding out of her own voice and into the voice of the puppet and engaging with it. It was like a traditional like ventriloquist type doll,
Sure.
And like the puppet would talk for her and cut her off and stuff like that. And I'm like, this is like, you are no longer one individual. I feel like your identity is merged with this other thing that wasn't real until you made it real, and then later on my crazy addiction, because like her family had you're addicted to your puppet intervention, like
no, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's one. But I've talked to several ventriloquists and stuff who talk about this, who talk about sort of that sliding between the two personalities. And it's really, really fascinating. It's also something that's, I think we all respect it on some level. In like medieval England, they used to do passion plays, the Bible stories, the Crustaceans across, things like that. And it became illegal to do them because the idea was actors are basically whores and criminals, and why are they pretending to impersonate religious figures? That's really blasphemous. And so the way these acting troupes got around it is they started doing the passion plays with puppets. And the authorities were like, oh yeah, well, as long as it's not people doing it, it's puppets, that's fine. But here's the kick, it's still people doing it. The puppets aren't real, they're not alive. It's people with little schmatas on their hands. And yet somehow the law recognized some distinction between the person and the puppet. It's really, because if you're regulating something as blasphemous, I'm not sure like God's gonna go, oh well, he had a little bit of felt on his hand when he was pretending to be Moses, so that's fine. It's really weird. And I used to do puppetry all the time, and I mean, I was in a radical puppet collective for a little bit, and you really do feel puppets and masks. You feel like it's a different person.
Okay, so what is a radical puppet collective?
We had no one leader. We did everything by consensus and democratic vote, and we were very politically minded. And so our shows were all political. They were about Hydro Quebec and Canada. They were we did the story in the book about the puppet show at the elementary school. I did that show. It was pre 9/11, so our version of the show was about Pinochet and his fascist regime in Chile and that disappeared. But I think it was just as incomprehensible to third graders. But for us, it was like, well, this is what we do. Why would we change our show? We do this kind of puppetry. We weren't asked to leave, but they weren't real thrilled, And I think they were more baffled than angry at like, what do we do? What are we doing? Like, what are we doing with, like, if you were showing third and fourth graders a show about, disappearing civilians to be politically tortured. I think rightly so. They questioned whether that was appropriate content.
That's amazing.
But when you put on a mask, and the puppets we did were big. I mean, they fit your whole body. So it's somewhere between a mask and a puppet. It really was a different personality. I mean, you would absolutely feel like someone else, and you would really feel the weight and the shape and the design of the mask or the puppet sort of informing what you did. So it was cool. I mean, it was really like getting to sort of do possession state 101. And there's a lot of cultures where wearing a mask and dancing or singing or performing music, helps you go into a trance state where you're possessed by a god or a spirit or something like that. So I mean, it's a pretty normal human experience. I just think it's not common. So it sounds weirder than it is. But yeah, I mean, I encourage anyone, like, make a mask, do some mask work. It's really fun, and it's the freakiest you can get while still being sober.
So, okay, so going a little bit to the characters. So first of all, there is one puppet in particular, who is sort of the puppet master or the master puppet. And I got a very awesome Thanksgiving card with him
Oh
on
yeah.
it. And I want to thank you because I will cherish that forever. But there's the story of it's Pumpkin, right?
Yeah.
And his relationship with Louise and Mark's mom, which kind of comes into play a lot because Louise hates Pumpkin.
Right.
He is terrifying to her. But you also talk about the book, The Velveteen Rabbit, which thank you, because that book terrified me as a kid. You say, like, there's a quote like, what the hell is a skin horse anyway?
Yeah. What is a skin horse? I still don't know. What there was an actual earlier version of the book where the skin horse makes an appearance. And it's just a snuffly thing with four, kind of like almost like a kid has drawn a horse with no head, and it just is sort of all made of skin, and it was disgusting. And my editor was like, this is really disgusting and disturbing, but I don't know if this book has room for psychically manifested children's books characters, which was a fair point. But yeah, the skin horse has always weirded me out.
I mean, I always thought it was a rocking horse that used an actual horse's skin. Was kind
Why
of
don't they just say that?
Yeah, thank you. But that's still kind of disturbing in general. So
yeah,
well,
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like a fake dead horse a child rides. Yeah, and also, I gotta say, after being to a certain number of weddings where people do readings of the Velveteen Rabbit, the book disturbed me as a kid, and that just really drove it home. And I hate this idea of like somehow getting battered and beaten and all, and really like broken and worn out somehow makes you more real and loved. I'm like, nah, that's not how it works. Like, it's just,
oh my God, I hate that those are readings at weddings. Yeah.
But it is like that message of like love will hollow you out and like remove everything about you that is you. And I'm like, that's a terrible message.
Yeah. Well, and there was always something in the Velveteen Rabbit, like just the masochism of these animals all clamoring for the boy, and the boy, like, he's like, whatever, yeah, I got sick, burn him in the trash, like, just. I mean, it's the same way. Like, I really like the Toy Story movies; they're adorable. But there is a part of me that's like, Andy, the kid, is getting off way too easy on these movies. Like, these toys are way too accepting of their quote unquote place in the world. Like, let's see a little revolutionary action, toys.
And the last one is Total Horror Story, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, I'm with you. The one with the like little dummies, the little like ventriloquist dummies in the antique store.
I can go on so many rants about why that movie was wrong. But we're talking about your book. So
sure.
So another thing like that really was great in the book. So you have the relationship with Louise and Mark and also the puppet, but you also have Louise and like her cousins and her aunts. Really, no, it was really well done.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, well, I mean, one of my sisters-in-law called me out years ago, back when I did my best friend's exorcism, pointing out they're like, my characters were all only children. And I was like, yeah, you're right, because we all exist in these big networks of family and extended family, but they're really hard to do. Like, it's like, that's why writers don't do them. They're really hard because you've got to come up with every member of the family. You got to come up with their relationship, what they're doing at all times, and it's a real pain in the butt. And so I really, with this book, wanted to sort of place Mark and Louise in a family, with relatives. And one of the things I always see in books, the other thing that I think people do that's a bit of a cheat is, the orphan thing. It's like, we exist in relationship to so many people around us. I feel like you kind of have to have them all in there. Like, we are not free of human familial relationships by the time we're 18. We're tangled up in them for the rest of our lives in one way or another. And so, I mean, when I see my friends, I'm 50, and when I see my friends, ever since our 40s, our number one topic of conversation is our crazy siblings who only, your siblings only get crazier as they get older. And then dealing with your parents and aging and dying and things. I mean, that's where you go naturally in a conversation. And so I felt like that stuff just had to be in there. And it's funny, the book I'm working on now is people who are deliberately separated from their families. But even then, I'm having to figure out their whole families, because it's like, well, is this an oldest child, or is this the youngest child? Is this a kid who misses their brothers and sisters, who misses their parents, or who doesn't? So I still had to do it. So I kind of created a problem where I need more and more background as I write my books for my characters in order to feel convincing to me as I write them, which means I'm writing slower and slower, which I hate. So yeah, it's I've created an issue for myself here.
Your book has a really interesting introduction where you talk about what drew you to trying your hand at Gothic horror, especially in like the context of like the COVID era. And I was wondering, talk a little bit about that, like what drew you to that at this particular time, and like maybe what do you think the influence of the pandemic has been on like your horror and maybe like horror at large, if that's something that you've given any thought.
Well, originally this book was going to come out in summer of 2021, I think. 2021? Yeah, summer of 2022. And so it had to be due midway through 2021. And it wasn't, but when I was writing it, the vaccines were just out. And when I had started it, this was going to be set in January of 2021, pre-vaccine really. And, they were just out. It was going to be a real COVID book. And as I started writing, the world started moving further and further away from there. And even though people are still dying of COVID, it feels very, like a book, your book set now, people aren't masking really much. Like, it's part of the background, not the foreground, for better or for worse. But the real impetus for this was sort of twofold. One is I missed my family during the lockdown, and I wanted to spend time with the family. And so I was able to create a book where I thought now's the time to take on that challenge and do a book about a family, and let me sort of make up this family and kind of spend time with them and all that. And because, thinking about, I've got this huge document. It's like year by year, this family, the vacations they took, the inside jokes, the sicknesses, all that stuff. And I also realized if I was writing a book about a family, it had to kind of be a haunted house book, and more of a classical one. Like, I did Horror Store about a haunted IKEA, but I need to do a more classic haunted house book, because those are always about families. They're about, the family secrets, the family curses, the family stories, and all that. And so I really found that kind of Gothic horror really, Gothic horror is about families, even if you look at some of the stuff that's not really classified as Gothic, like, I think Beloved by Toni Morrison and Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson are the two major horror novels of the 20th century, but they're both about families. Beloved is about losing your family and trying to put a new one together, and what that means. And Haunting of Hill House is all about Eleanor, who's just lost her mother and trying to find a new family to fit into. And so these books, like haunted house books, are just naturally, they're about families. I mean, The Shining, even though it's not a haunted house, it's a haunted hotel. It's all about the Torrance family. Burnt Offerings, a family goes off. There's that Amityville Horror is about a family. It just over and over again. If it's a haunted house, it's about a family. A Turn of the Screw. Even though that's ostensibly about a governess, it's all about this extended family around these two children who have this absentee guardian and the servants who stand in for their parents and how they took advantage of that position. So it's just, it was weird to me once I started looking, because sometimes you come up with these theses and you're like, oh yeah. But like the more I looked, the more I was like, oh my God, for once I was right. They are all about family. Towards the end of this book, I was reading a lot of Gothic romances, with the ones with the covers with the women running from houses. And they're so great. But again, they're all about family. They're all about marrying into a new family.
For sure. And I wondered, like, while you were talking, it occurred to me that, like, I wonder if, like, the pandemic functioned in families in a way that, like, the haunted house does in a Gothic story, because, like, the pandemic forced people together and, like, put them in more close contact for longer hours. And, like, maybe like ancient beefs came up, like, and so
Yeah.
it's interesting about how, like, maybe that's why we're so drawn to these stories about, like, confrontations and secrets coming out, and, like, all these things have been happening.
Well, and I think, you make a really good point, because I think two things happened, in my opinion. One is seeing family became a treat, not an obligation. If you didn't live with your family, like, you know what I mean? Like, you're not able to see them. So it's like, oh, I kind of want to now that, you know what I mean? Like now that it's not mandatory, I'm actually looking forward to it. And I think the other thing is when you're locked down together. I mean, I did a couple of Zoom meetings during the pandemic with people who'd been locked down with a partner and were getting a divorce, and we're locked down together or separated. And I also, like, know that one of the reason a lot of law enforcement officials feel like the homicide rate went up is because of the pandemic. People were sheltering together and there was a lot of interfamily homicide. Everyone was under a ton of stress, psychological pressure. And and it was weird because when those numbers went up, I think a lot of people were like, crime's going up, cities are in chaos, they're out of control. When really what a lot of it was, I'm depressed, I've lost my job, and my partner is really getting on my nerves. And if you, or my cousin or whoever, I mean, I can't tell you how many times in New York I would read like the little, like, police blotter thing, and it would be like, oh, two cousins got in an argument over the volume of the music and one of them went in the house and got a gun. Or, two people got in an argument over borrowing the car and one of them in the house and got a gun. Like, we were all up in each other's grills. It wasn't pretty.
Yeah, and I think like one thing, and it also kind of comes into play in this particular story, so Louise and Mark, like, they have their reasons for being not close. And I don't want to talk about it because you should read the book and find out exactly what is going on. I mean, there's a lot of family.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, there's a lot of family that is not close for various reasons. It's just very, very interesting.
Well, and also to that point though, Jessica, is also, I think we all think we know our family. Like I got my family figured out, and I can't tell you how disorienting it is when you're talking to a family member, especially a sibling, and their version of the same event is radically different from yours. And you're like, 100%.
Yeah.
What? How do you even think that?
But like one thing that's interesting about Mark and Louise, and this is something, like my parents, and this is a whole, who both recently passed, very close together, they came from an era when you did not really move too far away from your family. Although when they were growing up, like as adults, some of their siblings did move away, and family, like parents were like, how dare you do this? You're supposed to stay within the family. And I think, that's an interesting point about just, how connectivity of technology can either be like, it's okay that I'm moving away because we can, the long distance phone calls are not a thing anymore.
Yeah.
You don't have to call Western Union and, like telegram each other, like literally everything is instantaneous. But I think it's easier to move away from family now. And if you're estranged from family, it's kind of easier to absolve yourself from saying it's okay that I'm not going to be close to my parents and that I'm doing this thing. But the older generation doesn't necessarily feel the same way about it.
100%. Well, it's interesting. So my mom has two sisters, and their parents are in Charleston. Their parents' are all in Charleston. My mom and her sisters all live in Charleston and raised families there. And there are out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, out of 10 cousins my age, 2 live in Charleston. When before this generation, everyone lived in Charleston, on that side of the family. So you're right. You're 100% right. We're sort of that generation that's like, I'm going to move. I'm good. I don't want you in my house 3 times a week. Well, and I also think a lot of it was also jobs and work and just, you moved where your interests took you. I remember my grandfather really, really wanted to move to Columbia, which is about a 2-hour drive from Charleston. And my grandmother couldn't stand to live away from her mother because she saw her so much. And so they stayed in Charleston. And that's like 2 hours away. That's nothing.
Yeah, that is really interesting to me because there are these like generational divides that you, I think, do see in this story. And like the way that, I'm going to try to talk about it vaguely as to not give so much away, but, like parents have expectations, and siblings will either fulfill them or not fulfill them. And that creates like different feelings of parents towards different children. And then that makes like siblings resent each other and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's just so much, like it's such a complex, like emotional dynamic of people who are like sitting on these truths in order to keep the peace, but like just sort of, things simmering and bubbling up that like won't be kept.
Yeah. No, 100%. Listen, my family, like, right now, one of the things is I'm the youngest, I'm the only boy. And in my family, we're all big readers. So, my mom's eating this up, that, I'm a writer and I make a living at it and all that. She loves it and she's good. And I'm glad she loves it. But like my sisters are just like, if I hear one more thing about you, I swear I'm going to fly to New York and beat you to death with one of your books. And we get along and everything, but I'm glad they're able to say that, because if they thought they weren't able to, I think they would murder me eventually.
Which book did they say?
They didn't specify. No, I imagine it would have to be a hardcover or like 3 of the trade paperbacks just held, together.
Right.
But yes, but like I can see like how that would be really obnoxious, in your family, if you felt like you couldn't say that. And also, it's funny, like my parents got divorced when I was 13, and my youngest sister is about 6 years older than I am. So they were all out of the house when my parents got divorced. So my sisters are always like, oh, you're so spoiled. You didn't have to follow the same rules we did. You got all this, you get everything. I'm like, dude, this is not fun. Do you think this is fun here? I don't have a license. I can't get out of the house. And our parents are crazy and getting divorced. I don't want to be here. I will swap places gladly with any of you. So it's like everyone thinks they have their family all figured out, but everyone is wrong.
Another thing, just really quickly, because I know we have to wrap up soon, is just like I love the emotion that you put into horror. There are a lot of moments in this book where I was kind of like physically reacting. But the emotion of everything just kept me in it. And it's just really, really well done. Was this I mean, I know that everything is set in your old neighborhood or, around Charleston. Yeah. Was there a lot of personal stuff that was kind of like put into the story? Because it felt very real.
Oh, sure. I mean, you know, there's sort of three angles on that. And one is, I try to use real places and people. Like, no one's actually anyone in my books, but like everyone starts off based on someone I know or some characteristic I know, and someone no one's ever like been like, oh, that's me. It's not like that. But you know, but the house Mark and Louise live in, that's my aunt's house that I love that house. Like that's where we did all our Thanksgivings and Christmases. So I try to like put on, and there's a lot of like slightly altered family stories in here and a lot of childhood memories and things. I mean, and incidents. So yeah, I try to put all that in because I want to be having a genuine emotional reaction as I write it. And then the other thing is I write about stuff I care about a lot. Like, you know, I really am trying to think through, I'm very lucky. My parents are both still alive, but I am trying to think through like what happens next, you know, and what's that going to be like? Because I also know my dad has especially had a health scare before where it was very much pack a suit, come home. And even in that moment, it taught me enough to know no matter how prepared I think I am, I'm not prepared. Like no matter how much I think it through, it's going to blindside me. And so that's a really, and also like, you know, I am interested in my family and how people, brothers and sisters relate to each other. And also our relationship with inanimate objects, which is weird, and childhood stuffed animals. And so I try to set it and pack it with a lot of emotional stuff for me. I try to make it about stuff that's emotional stuff I care about. And then the third thing is the emotions are the only thing that matters. You know, otherwise you wind up in this sort of empty arms race where it's like, okay, a haunted puppet. Now what about a haunted clown? Now what about a haunted giant clown? Okay, now a haunted giant clown with lawnmower blades for teeth. Like you keep escalating this physical stuff. Whereas if people just care about these characters, those physical stakes can stay realistic because you care. You know, I just read the William Goldman book Magic about the guy with the killer ventriloquist dummy. And it's a tough, but it's really a disorienting book for the first 30 or 40 pages. And I stuck with it. And I actually am glad I did because it's a really brilliant book, but it's a book with a very low body count. But you're so emotionally sucked into it that there were a couple of moments where I really was cringing hard. And I rarely do that, because I'm like, no, how can you, and so I feel like that emotional connection that I try to make with the book and the subject matter works for the reader, because that way we don't wind up in a gore fest or a zombie fest, or just having to escalate the physical stuff. The emotional stuff works, I hope.
It absolutely does. And, you know, that leads me to, I think what my last question is the central sibling relationship here, because it is so powerful and it is like really raw, you know. Mm-hmm. And I'm really interested in how, like, you know, when you were talking about masks earlier, I was thinking about how like the mother's presence, like in their children's life in this story, sort of like almost acts like a mask, you know, because like everybody behaves and everybody keeps quiet in order to like not upset mom, who wants to keep the peace, you know. And then when mom disappears, like the mask comes off and all these like long held tensions come up, and like it's just so raw that sometimes I was just like, whoo, boy, like this is like it's like that is where the horror is for me. Like it is emotional horror, because thinking about yourself going through those things is just like is awful, but therapeutic too. Yeah.
Yeah, somewhat. But you know, but that is like, how often do like people and families use other people as like a mask or an excuse to do something like, oh, your father's going to be so upset, or like, you know, we stayed together for you kids, or like, you know, you can't like do that, mom will be so hurt. Like, I mean, just and I think we're usually wrong. I mean, we're the ones who have the issue. We had a thing in our family a few months ago where one person was kept being like, I don't want to use any names, but one member of my family kept texting everyone with all these concerns over the psychological health of this other member of the family. And I'm just like, project much? Like, they're fine. You're the one who's going through this really stressful, I didn't say this, but I was like, they were going through a really stressful situation, but they projected it onto another member of the family. And it's just like, And we were all just like, well, what? Come on. Like, and it was very hard not to call them out on it, but that would have been the worst thing possible.
I just want to thank you. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. I would love to do an event with you at some point in the future.
I know. It's they packed me up. I'm like booked up through March ridiculously, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Everybody, please read How to Sell a Haunted House. I don't think you need any prior knowledge of Grady's previous books to read it. But there are Easter eggs and I appreciate them.
You yes. Saw those. I'm glad.
Of course. Of course. Yeah.
The Mount Pleasant verse, the Charleston verse.
Yeah.
No, it was good to chat with you. Thank you for doing this, Jen. And Jessica, take care of yourself, please.
Oh, thank you so much. So once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. Our guest today, and my library co-host was.
Hi, Jen. Goodbye.
And our guest was.
Grady Hendrix.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.